अस्सलाम वालेकुम ख़वातीन व हज़रात, वेलकम बैक टू अनदर एपिसोड ऑफ थॉट बिहाइंड थिंग्स। आज हमारे साथ मौजूद हैं एक बहुत ही ख़ास मेहमान जो कि पाकिस्तान में आई हुई ऑल द वे फ्रॉम यूरोप, और उनको इंट्रोड्यूस करवाने से पहले मैं एक तो माज़रत करना चाहूँगा। दिस इज़ गोइंग टू बी माई थर्ड गेस्ट हु आई विल बी स्पीकिंग टू इन कंप्लीट इंग्लिश, सो आई अपोलोजाइज फॉर दैट इन द स्टार्ट। वी हैव विद अस टुडे Riina Kionka. She is the European Union Ambassador to Pakistan. Riina, thank you so much for being part of the show.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Riina, I'm going to start off the conversation with just trying to understand a little bit about your early life. Where were you born and where did you get your education and what was early life like for you? अगर आपने पैसिव इनकम के बारे में परेशान है, खासकर आजकल की इकोनॉमी में जहां पर ऑलरेडी कैश कंटिन्यूअसली बर्न हो रहा है और इन्फ्लेशन हमें मार रही है, तो आई एम प्राउड टू अनाउंस दैट दिस वीडियो इज इन पार्टनरशिप विद सरमाया फाइनेंशियल्स। दे आर ऑफरिंग टू वेरी कूल ट्रेनिंग्स, कैपिटल मार्केट फंडामेंटल्स, जिसमें आप स्टॉक्स और म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट करना सीखेंगे और अंडरस्टैंड करेंगे कि आखिर एक कंपनी के अंदर क्या ऐसे फंडामेंटल्स होते हैं जिनको आपने देखना होता है टू फिगर आउट कि वो एक अच्छी कंपनी है टू इन्वेस्ट इन। और दूसरी ट्रेनिंग है टेक्निकल एनालिसिस मास्टर क्लास, जिसमें आप सीखेंगे कि किस तरीके से हम डिफरेंट ट्रेडेबल एसेट्स लाइक कमोडिटीज, फॉरेक्स, स्टॉक्स, क्रिप्टो के अंदर थोड़े से पैसे लगाकर बहुत ज़्यादा पैसे बना सकते हैं। पर्सनली ये ट्रेनिंग मैंने भी ली है एंड इट्स एब्सोल्युटली फिनोमिनल। द लिंक टू द ट्रेनिंग्स आर इन द डिस्क्रिप्शन बिलो। चेक देम आउट एंड बिकम फाइनेंशियली हेल्दी। एंड नाउ बैक टू द पॉडकास्ट।
Well, I was born in the United States actually, and grew up there. I am a child of refugees. My mother and her family came to the United States after, as a result of the Second World War, and they fled Estonia,
Right.
When the Soviet Union came in. So that meant that I had a kind of special sort of childhood, in that I wasn't really, local. I wasn't really an American, but I grew up in a very Estonian kind of child, in a household where we spoke Estonian at home. My father was not Estonian. He was an English speaker, and so the normal sort of way we spoke among the family at home was constant translation. So my sister and I would translate into Estonian for my grandmother who lived with us. It was a kind of 3-generation family, very typical of Pakistan actually.
Yeah.
And we would go the other way too. So we would translate from Estonian into English for my father. So it was a kind of multiple identity childhood from the very start, and it was colored very much as well by the fact that my mother was a refugee.
Just to ask, were you guys very well integrated in Estonia, and when the war happened, was that a completely random transition where you just had to flee to the US, or do you think whether the war had happened or not, maybe you guys would still have moved?
Oh, they would have stayed. They would have stayed for sure. Nobody leaves their country voluntarily.
Yeah.
Well, some people do for economic reasons, but no, it was because of war. War came, and it was going to be a bad situation, so they left, like hundreds of thousands of other wartime refugees who flowed, westward within Europe. So no, they would not have. Had it been a different way, I would have probably grown up in Estonia.
Yeah. Do you think that experience? Obviously, US was a great sort of developed nation, but do you think that experience had some sort of trauma on the refugees who eventually had to flee, leaving everything behind?
Absolutely. And I remember even in my childhood, my mother would wake up in the middle of the night to nightmares about having to flee, about having to leave her homeland. She didn't go directly to the United States. Of course, the U.S. Right after the war had not opened its doors to refugees, as had not also Canada and Australia and some of the other places. So she lived for 6 years in a refugee camp, and it was only in the late 1940s when various immigration countries around the world said, okay, there's an issue. We need to accommodate these refugees from Eastern Europe someplace. And that's when they started opening their doors.
Right. And what part of the US were you in?
I grew up in Michigan, in the area of the Great Lakes, not too far from Chicago.
Right. And were you educated there as well?
Yes. So I
all throughout the up until college?
the whole thing, the whole enchilada, as they say. So I went to school there, finished school, then went to my, I did my bachelor's degree at Michigan State University, which is smack in the middle of the state. Very wholesome kind of place, but I was studying in a kind of small college within the larger university that was focused on policy studies, foreign policy studies. So it got fairly early. I got into this kind of mindset, and then I did my PhD later in New York City at Columbia University. And
in what area?
In political science, international relations.
So do you think part of you being a second generation refugee family or being from Estonia and then coming to the US was what pushed you towards political science and foreign policy, or what was it at the time that made you take this decision? And this, I'm assuming, is the 70s?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Good math skills. Well, yes, I would say that was directly responsible. Of course, I came from a family of medical professionals.
Right.
Mom was a pharmacist. My father was a dentist. My sister turned into a neurologist. I mean, the whole family is full of doctors and dentists.
Do you guys have that pressure in Europe where the family is like, you have to be a doctor as well?
Yeah. It's very, very Pakistani in that respect as well. So. Yeah. So my sister turned into the doctor, and I'm the only one who went in a different direction. But for me, it was very clear, from the start, I was interested in things international. I was clearly, interested in righting injustices. So I first wanted to, one of the first ideas I had was to become a lawyer. That was after, while I was in school, I wanted to become a musician. But we might get to that later. But, so righting wrongs or righting injustices, that's what drew me to the idea of being a lawyer. And so that's what I was thinking of the first couple of years of university. But then I found out what lawyers do. And I was no longer interested, and then I went in kind of an international direction. I started learning Russian. I was anyway speaking German. I had started learning German before, and one thing led to another.
Makes sense. And so did you pursue your education one after the other? Or so it was like bachelor's, master's, and PhD, or did you work somewhere in the middle as well?
Well, this is funny because my daughter is going through the exact same thing right now. So I finished university, and I wanted to work for a couple of years. Wanted to earn some money and get some experience, but I couldn't find a job. This was in 1983. And it was it was kind of a mini recession at the time, and nobody was finding jobs, especially if you had studied international relations, which is not exactly very marketable. So I remember having sent out tens and tens of application letters, which is how it was done now. Now it's all online, but at that time you wrote a letter, you signed it, you licked a postage stamp, you put it on the envelope, and off it went. And then you started getting I started getting the rejection letters one by one. And so what I did is I took basically a gap year after university, and I worked 4 different jobs in the same city where I had gone to uni, and saved up my money for graduate school, and then off I went.
And these were odd jobs, basically, or were they part of your profession?
No, they had nothing to do with. So one of them was selling coffee beans in a kind of coffee shop before there was Starbucks and all that sort of thing. I was also, another of my jobs was being a personal assistant to a quadriplegic man who was a student at the university.
What's a quadriplegic?
Somebody who cannot use, because of a spinal injury, their arms or legs.
Right.
So it was very hands-on. I also did some translation from English and from German into English of legal documents.
So you know Russian, you know Estonian, you also knew German?
Yes, because I studied German in school and at university.
How many languages could you speak?
Then? Well, then it was 3, but now it's 5, I guess.
Wow.
But this is not so unusual in Europe, actually, is it?
Really? Are these languages sort of, do they interlink one way or the other? Are they similar in certain areas?
Not as similar as they could be. So, so German, French, Russian are all Indo-European languages, as is English. Estonian, of course, is Finno-Ugric. It's a different language group altogether, but I learned it, as a child growing up, so I didn't have to learn it as a foreign language, thank goodness, because it's supposed to be just as hard as Urdu.
Really?
In fact, yeah.
Interesting. And these odd jobs, essentially, that you worked, you did during that gap year, do you think that impacted your life in any way?
Yeah, maybe want to go back to school so I could get a real job.
So you didn't like that year? Yeah.
Well, no, it was fine. It was. The fourth job, actually, I didn't mention, it was working in a pizza shop. And my friends at the time thought I should open up my own pizza joint, call it Pizzarina. But, at the very beginning, after 4 years of pretty hard studying, then it was a real joy to do something very simple and, slice tomatoes and slice onions and, enjoy the red color of the tomatoes. But that lasted about 6 weeks, and then I started applying for graduate programs.
And then you pursued your master's in the same field?
In international relations, yeah. So I was studying to be a Soviet specialist, actually, at the time.
Right, and this was during the Cold War era?
Well, it was toward the tail end, yeah. So I started at Columbia University in 1984. Mm-hmm. And it was in 1986 that the Gorbachev and the Perestroika and all the opening up of the Soviet Union kind of began officially.
That makes sense. And so, what was your research focus during your PhD?
Well, it wasn't. This was not a linear process. So I did all my coursework. Mm-hmm. Which and the general exams, which is this big scary exam that everybody has to do before you start writing the dissertation. So I did all of that, and then off I went to do something else, and that's maybe the next chapter. But there were 13 years in between when I started and when I actually finished, because I went off and engaged in real life, and things were happening politically in Europe, and it was so. My research focus when I started was Soviet foreign policy, and also with a concentration on what was Soviet nationality policy. So mainly what the non-Russians within the Soviet Union were up to, because I'm Estonian, because I was interested in that sort of thing. By the time I finished, of course, the whole thing had fallen apart. So my focus was a little different then.
Right. And so you mentioned that you went off and started working. What was your first job out of university?
I was a research analyst at Radio Free Europe. Mm-hmm. in Munich at the time in Germany, and my job was to read the papers, analytical articles, and that sort of thing, and then write short, sort of one-pager analytical articles that could be used on air.
Right.
And it wasn't for use on air by the Estonian language service of Radio Free Europe. And Radio Free Europe at the time had, I think, 22 or 23 different languages. It was broadcasting into the former Soviet bloc and the Eastern Bloc. It was for the other radio services to fulfill a need that was called cross-reporting. And so the point of cross-reporting was that the people listening to the radio in country X would know also what's happening in country Y. And the whole point, or the basis, the point of departure really for that radio station was that there wasn't a free media. And so this was called surrogate broadcasting. And it's something that Deutsche Welle does for Germany, BBC, has a services in different languages like that as well. The Voice of America, that sort of thing.
So what do you mean by free media? Free in terms of being able to consume it, like broadcast for free,
like censorship. I mean, what we're talking about is the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So there was no free media then. So there was the papers wrote the line that was given from the center, and journalists were not free to write what they saw, what they thought, that sort of thing.
Right. And so how long did you work there?
Just about 4 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this was from 1989 to 93. Right.
Right. And then what was your next transition?
My next move was, in between, Estonia had become independent. The Soviet Union had fallen apart. The Warsaw Pact had fallen apart. There was a kind of reverse dominoes that all of Eastern... Yeah.
Estonia was part of the Soviet Union at the time?
It was, de facto, yes, it was. The 3 Baltic states were occupied and annexed by the Soviet Union in 1945.
And was your mother alive when Estonia got its freedom?
Yes, she's still alive, actually.
She's still alive, that's amazing.
Yes.
So how did she feel? I mean, what must that day have felt like for Estonians around the world?
Well, it was incredible. It was a dream come true, really. It was what they had been working for, and like many Pakistanis living overseas, Estonians and all the Baltic states really, and all Eastern Europeans living in other parts of the world were very politically active.
Right. It must have been quite like a dream.
It was. It really was. It was. It was something that everybody had, thought about and dreamt about, but maybe never really thought it would happen. And then it happened. So.
And did your family, your other families, then eventually go back to Estonia just to sort of visit and?
Yes.
Because my assumption is nobody visited during the time that Soviet had occupied it.
Nobody from my family did. There were some people who went and had cultural contacts with writers or filmmakers, that sort of thing. But it was a tricky business. It was kind of, you would be followed, you would be listened to and so forth, listened in on. And so most of the refugee community or the diaspora did not visit before that. After Estonia became independent, then a lot of people started visiting. I was already going before that time because I was working at Radio Free Europe, and so I needed to do research. And during the whole transition, then I was starting to make fairly frequent trips to Estonia to, see it in action.
Right. And so you were telling me about the transition, the move from Radio Free Europe to...
So I'm in my early 30s at the time. I've been writing analysis at the research arm of the radios. My PhD is not done, but it's kind of pining away, waiting for me, kind of quietly saying, please come back and write the dissertation. But the world around me is so exciting, so interesting that I thought, I just can't do this. And so I went off to the radios, and after a certain point, after Estonia became independent again, reinstated independence, carried out the first free and fair elections, did the monetary reform, got out of the ruble zone, and wrote a new constitution. At that point, I thought, this is irreversible. This is the way it's going to be. And it became somehow suddenly really boring to sit in Munich, far away, and write analysis when at the same time I could join this, new establishment, this new state, and to quote Dean Acheson, a former U.S. Secretary of State, to be present at the creation. And that's really what it was. We were creating a kind of new administration. So I joined I quit my job. Mm-hmm. Many family members thought I was a little bit crazy, but off I went, and I joined the new foreign ministry.
Of Estonia?
Of Estonia, yeah. And they needed people. It was very small at the time. And so the first thing I did was to set up a policy planning group within the ministry who would work on sort of forward analysis, forward thinking, as well as we did speech writing. So I have a kind of a speech writing feather in my cap as well from the very way long ago.
Interesting. How long were you working for the ministry there?
Well, until I joined the European Union.
Oh, so for essentially that was the main highlight of your career for most part.
Well, I don't know if that was the highlight, but that was during, I guess it was 12 years or so that I was an Estonian diplomat.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So why did you shift from that to the European Union eventually?
Well, at that point, I had been in Estonia. I had worked at the headquarters. I had been Estonian ambassador to Germany, which was one of the most important posts. I had accompanied also my husband, who was also an Estonian diplomat, and we had come back to Tallinn, and I was undersecretary for European affairs, which is kind of like deputy minister. And my main interest has always been foreign policy, not necessarily administration, and so there was no place else to go, actually. So I couldn't envisage another 20-25 years basically bopping around Europe, mostly Europe, because Estonia is a small country, so it has a limited number of embassies, most of them being in industrialized, very comfortable countries. But I was interested in something, a bigger pond, maybe. Let's put it that way.
And so did you apply for the European Union thing, or did they poach you?
Estonia joined the European Union in 2004. And when any new country joins, then it has to it has to populate also it sends people to work in the institution. So you apply. There are competitions. You take part in that. They're very rigorous. And fortunately, I got through one of them, and then in 2005 I left for Brussels. So.
And have you been with the European Union ever since?
Yes.
So that's 18 years.
Yeah, that's right.
That's quite a time. What are the different positions that you've been at in the European Union?
Well, I spent most of my 18 years, most of those were in Brussels at headquarters. First of all, working on transatlantic affairs. For 7 years, I worked on human rights policy, and was High Representative Javier Solana's representative for human rights, so did a lot of travel. Then I worked on Central Asia for a few years, and for 5 years I was the diplomatic advisor to President Donald Tusk, who at the time was the president of the European Council, which is the committee of the EU where all the heads of state and government sit. So the prime ministers, basically, their committee, and who presides over it is the president of the European Council. So I was his diplomatic advisor.
Right. When we look at Europe, obviously we're reminded time and time again of the First World War and the Second World War, big courtesy to Hollywood, and so what we see is just Europe just tearing itself apart, and it's phenomenal how that they've been able to evolve into this sort of a collaborative union that diplomatically, yes, it's doing a lot of things, but there are a lot of other areas where, in terms of the economy, in terms of a lot of these things, they've been able to collaborate and work together. Tell me a little bit about that history of how that came about, considering even up until the late 90s, we had two very major superpowers fighting, carving out Europe and trying to, divide these countries with East and West Germany, and even Estonia getting, independent fairly late. How did that sort of converge into the European Union that we see today?
That's a great question. it got its start really in the post-war period in Europe, and this is a situation. If you picture it, it's war-torn Europe. It's devastated. There's no economy. People have lost their homes. The people are displaced all over the place, and it's all because of wars amongst ourselves, wars that European countries and peoples and nations imposed on others. And so just during that same century, there were two world wars where two historic enemies, Germany and France, were at each other's throats. And so if you fast forward then to the post-war period, everybody was thinking, is it enough that the UN that had just been created, is that really enough to keep the peace in Europe? And then there was a French foreign minister at the time whose name was Robert Schuman, not the composer, the other one. And Robert Schuman, as foreign minister, came up with this brilliant idea to pool the markets, the production of coal and steel in something called then the European Coal and Steel Community. And the whole point of that was not only to make war unthinkable, again, between Germany and France, but to make it materially impossible to carry out. And that was how the whole thing got started. So,
what year was this?
This was 1950. The Schuman Declaration, which is considered to be the kind of the birthday of what became later the European Union. That was in 1950.
And you mentioned materially impossible. Why do you say so?
Because each of the two main warring sides needed the other to produce armaments or anything else you need for war. So it was a brilliant idea, and out of that then flowed all of the rest of it. So there are people who say, the most successful peace project in the world is the European Union because it brought together two countries that had, and the surrounding countries who had been at war with each other for so many times, sworn enemies of each other, and now they were brought together. So it's at its heart, the European Union is a peace project, and in fact, the Nobel Peace Committee honored or recognized that role for the European Union in 2012 and gave the EU the Nobel Peace Prize.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so when was it? So take me through the history. Yeah. So how did it sort of go from this sort of small pact to mine coal? I'm assuming.
To what?
What was the pact about?
Coal and steel.
Yeah, and from that to this sort of huge undertaking.
Yes.
Yeah. How did
it was? This was another brilliant move, that the methodology that this Robert Schuman came up with, and the point was, you take incremental steps, itty bitty, teeny tiny baby steps, on very practical, very sort of boring matters, and through that you build a culture of trust. You build a culture of working together, and don't think about the end state. Think about the process. And this focus on the process is what led to where we are today. So after the coal and steel community came the European community, and it would, with each year or each time we had a new treaty, new policy areas would be added. Justice and home affairs, or trade, a big one, the European single market, and so on and so forth, until we came to a situation where we are today, where we cover the waterfront really in policy terms. There are huge areas that the member states have given, in which the member states have given over sovereignty or their decision making to a collective, they have told the European Commission that you're in charge of this and that, and we're fine with that, and go ahead and run with the ball. And then there are other policy areas where they retain a kind of veto power. And then there are other policy areas in which the member states sit together and debate and decide which direction to go. And one of those is foreign policy, for instance. So each member state has a veto, but actually within the European Union, it's very rare that you actually vote on something like that. It's the process is debate, discussion until you reach a consensus. And so I'm getting maybe into a little more detail than one would like. Most Europeans, I have to tell you, most Europeans don't understand either how the European Union works. So
there's a European Union Parliament as well, right?
Yes. So
is that elected?
It is. It's directly elected. So the constituents directly elect X person to go to Parliament. It's a big Parliament. It has over 700 members.
So does it have seats allotted to each country? So for example, Estonia would have certain seats and Estonians would elect their representatives to the European Union Parliament?
Correct. So the number of seats is divided according to population. So the most populous country, Germany, has the most, and some of the smaller ones, Malta, for instance, or Luxembourg, they would have fewer seats. Estonia has, I think, 6 or 7 parliamentarians.
Right.
So there are 3 main institutions. Can we get into this? Or
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah.
Okay. So there are lots of institutions and lots of agencies, but the 3 main ones are that all the that our listenership has probably heard of are the European Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament.
Right.
And the job of the European Commission, that's what we call the community method. So what the Commission is working on are things that are issues in which the member states have said, you guys do it. Give us proposals and then we'll decide. So that's what the Commission does. It has the right to make proposals. Who does it make proposals to? Well, then we come to the Council. The Council is where the member state representatives sit together. And they sit together in various formations. So the foreign ministers are sitting together, the finance ministers are sitting together, and they do this about every month or so. And some of them have special names like ECOFIN. Maybe you've heard of the term ECOFIN. That's where the finance ministers sit together. And this is all called the Council, but it just has different formations. What they do is they decide, or they get proposals from the Commission, and then they debate and decide which direction to go. And then there's the European Parliament, directly elected, with representation based on population. And after the latest treaty changes, the European Parliament has quite a lot of power, much more power, I would say, than most Europeans even understand. The European Parliament has to take a stand as co-legislator on 95% of all the legislation that comes through the European Union.
Interesting.
So they have quite a big role to play.
Right. For a lot of people in Pakistan, a lot of their interfacing with the European Union began to happen when the UK was leaving the EU. And nobody understood what was going on, to be very honest. They just knew that, okay, UK was part of the EU and now it's not anymore. Run me through a little bit about what happened there and what happened?
Oh, if I could tell you exactly, then I'd be a millionaire. What happened was that there was and you should really ask the UK High Commissioner, the next one who comes in. What happened was it was a political problem, first and foremost. The UK leadership, which was led at the time by the Conservative Party, decided to have a referendum on whether to stay or whether to leave the European Union. And this was because of years of kind of griping and sniping and uncertainty over whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. Basically that started when the UK joined the EU in 1973. It always, there was always quite a strong constituency of those who didn't think the EU was a good deal for for the UK. And so at one point, these voices who were agitating for a better deal said, you need to take a stand. David Cameron, who was the PM at the time, and he called a referendum. And he bet on the wrong horse. The referendum delivered a vote of leaving the European Union. And what happened after that was several years of, I think it's 3 years or 4 years of discussion, withdrawal talks, basically divorce proceedings, which covered every single policy area that the EU works on, because this was, we hadn't been set up for.
Yeah, and it was very well integrated, right?
Extremely well integrated. The EU, there are so many policy areas where, you can't really
disconnect.
Do anything. You can't disconnect overnight. No, you just can't turn the light off. And so these were extremely complicated withdrawal talks. We were set up for enlargement. The European Union has enlarged several times, and we know exactly how to do that. And it's an arduous process, I can tell you, from an enlargement country, because I saw firsthand and took part in aspects of the enlargement talks when Estonia was joining. But this was in reverse, so it's like putting the film in reverse order, and nobody knew how to do that. We were, it had to be made up as we went along, and so finally, there was an agreement, the withdrawal agreement that was concluded, and then they left.
Right. You mentioned the political problem, and I feel like we're now in a very weird time, where all across the world we're seeing, some say it's because of social media, some say it's because of God alone knows what, but we live in a world of polarization and extreme views. And in a lot of countries, quite surprisingly in Europe as well, we've seen the rise of right-wing governments and right-wing political parties, and they generally... So when you looked at Europe and when you looked at European Union as well, you had a certain understanding of how they would think, and it was very sort of globalized, and it was very sort of collaborative and driven around being very open. But now we're hearing more and more about individual countries from Europe talking about closing themselves up. Obviously, a lot of what's happened over the last few years with the Syrian war and the refugees coming in and a lot of other things has definitely impacted, the life, culture, and societies of countries in Europe. But how do you see this changing, these changing views of European population in general, and that being represented with this rise of right-wing governments in, first of all, European Union as the way that it operates, because it seems like there is a new reality that the world is seeing, and we are going to go to Ukraine-Russia conflict as well, and I think that's just completely flipped the reality altogether. But in terms of the rise of the right wing, how do you see the European Union maneuvering through it, and how much does that impact the European Union?
Oh, a lot. We are not immune to these same forces that we've seen elsewhere, certainly in the United States, many other places in the globe.
Many other places, yeah. It's a global phenomenon. I think it's a changing time, and a lot of people are confused about what's going on as well.
Yeah, and I think also it's kind of it's some kind of a gut reaction, anti-reaction to the bad sides of globalization.
Right.
Really. So it's to really kind of turn inward, turn more national, more protectionist, that sort of thing. So, we're not immune, certainly, to that. And but I would say that this was already happening well before the Syrian crisis.
Right.
You could see it in the kind of the voting in the European Parliament, where increasingly there were smaller splinter parties, many of them on the far right or the far left, who were being returned to the Parliament instead of the big traditional big three blocks, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, and the Greens or the Liberals. And around what it must have been 2010, 2010, the return to the parliament started to splinter. And so it was well before Syria. But it was the migration, the refugee crisis, really, that catalyzed some of the national leaderships in some of our member states to go in a certain direction and not in another. How does it impact upon the European Union? It makes everything a lot more difficult, of course, because the EU is founded on human rights and respect and protection and promotion of human rights, and that means human rights for all humans. So it assumes fundamental freedoms that in some places we're starting to get a little soft. And so that if you don't start from the same point of departure, if you don't sing from the same song sheet, then it's going to be out of tune, and it's going to be much more difficult then to achieve consensus. And for an organization, the member states working together who are working toward consensus, of course, it becomes more difficult.
Right. How do you think the Russian-Ukraine crisis changed this situation? Again, I mean, it's one after the other, right? It's a lot of polarization. Then COVID happens, everything stops, and then the Russia-Ukraine war, and I think the maximum impact that war has been on Europe. I was reading an article on The Economist on their outlook for the future, and they said, even the US may have to deal with some forms of recession, but Europe is really going to suffer, unfortunately. Before we get into your thoughts on that conflict and what's going on there, tell me about how it has impacted Europe ever since the start.
Well, Russia's aggression on Ukraine, and let's be clear here, this was an invasion that was unjustified. It was illegal by international law. It was unprovoked. It was just one big country marching into its neighbor. Not unheard of, but certainly unheard of. This is 2023. That was 2022. One thought that we had, evolved.
Moved past.
Yeah. But no. So when Russia invaded Ukraine and leashed upon it this brutal war that's going on, it was a wake-up call. It was a wake-up call for Europe that, first of all, that this Russia wasn't going to turn into the democratic country all of us hoped it would. It was a wake-up call in terms of defense and security. It revolutionized in many ways how the European Union deals with defense and security. Denmark, which has had an opt-out on defense matters, rejoined, had a referendum and rejoined the European Union's security arm. We had Finland and Sweden, our member states, applying to join NATO, which is a real revolution. We had member states agreeing to use EU budget for sending military aid to Ukraine, which we've done now twice, and not small change. So these are all revolutionary steps. So it was a wake-up call in terms of security and defense as well. And many people thought that it would be over in a snap because Russia would go in. 5 days later, Kiev would fall. The soldiers who were the first ones to go in fact, had this has been all over the media, but they had packed, not enough warm clothing or anything like that. They had packed their dress uniforms, though, because they were expecting a victory parade. after 2 or 3 days. Well, as we all know, that didn't happen. The Ukrainian people mobilized as a total force. Thousands, millions of refugees, mostly women and children, came to Europe, came across the border to the western side. The men stayed to fight, and so it was a wake-up call also in terms of the stability of this beautiful post-war dream that we had all built together, that it was not quite as certain as everybody had come to presume. You know, you don't. It was a rehash, really, of what we saw in the run-up to and during the Second World War. So I think it was a massive wake-up call, and you know, I'm quite proud of the EU that it has reacted with such unity, such singularity of purpose. We're now preparing our 10th set of package of sanctions. We have sent, as I mentioned before, military assistance, and there's, it's a kind of existential moment for us.
In a lot of ways, Europe wasn't keen on weaponization after the World War. They'd seen what that does to communities and people. But after the war, I was seeing how I believe Germany was really upped their budget in terms of defense, and a lot of other countries were reportedly doing the same. Do you think now this conflict is now taking us to a world where, again, we're becoming more cynical, we're becoming more defensive, and therefore we're weaponizing? In a macro sense, it's going to be a much more insecure world, because as you begin to lose trust, the trust, like you mentioned, of this beautiful dream, that we've evolved as humans to a point where conventional war shouldn't exist anymore. But unfortunately, that's still there. And while it's there, now that dream has shattered and that trust lost, do you think we're now going back towards a weaponized, I don't know how to put it, but it's a scary future, right?
Europe has been, I don't want to say weaponized, but it has a good capacity to defend itself together with the United States and Canada within the form of NATO.
Right.
Not everyone is part of NATO, but it's getting increasingly popular. So I don't see a difference there. I don't see a specter weaponization, because self-defense mechanisms and armaments have been in place the whole time. I would not say that this crisis, the Russia's war on Ukraine has made us more cynical. I think it's made us see much more clearly, actually, what is right, what is wrong, and I think it's solidifying the determination even more than during this, the Second World War, that to make sure this never happens again. It's still going on. It's early to talk about how this ends.
Of course.
But yeah.
Last couple of questions on Russia, Ukraine. First, Russians basically say that this aggression came in from NATO expanding its borders and coming right to the border of Russia. And for a lot of people elsewhere, they don't really know the dynamic of the conflict. What would you say about that in terms of an apparent regime change in Ukraine in 2014-15, and then NATO expanding its borders completely, what they had originally promised, and over the last couple of decades, really coming to the backyard of Russia, as they'd call it, making Russians defensive. Do you think that was differently? That could have been played out differently.
Yeah, I've heard this argument many times. It's nonsense. NATO is not an organization, a military alliance that expands. NATO, the countries that want to join NATO have to join. They ask to join. Then they ask to join for a very good reason. Like the country I know best, Estonia, asked to join. It wasn't NATO imposing itself, saying, now you're going to join us because we're expanding and we want to get closer to Russia. No. It was all the countries in between, who were what we think of as former Eastern Europe or, parts of the Soviet Union, saying, we don't want to be caught in a security vacuum. We're between, here we are, between Russia and we're moving toward the European Union maybe, but we need military security as well. We need to be able to protect ourselves. And please, NATO, we would like to be part of you. And then NATO says, okay, so you have to jump through this, that, and the third hoop. You have to demonstrate that you add value. You have to show us you're interoperable. You have to share our values. And that's how NATO gets bigger. It doesn't expand like some kind of dangerous amoeba. It allows new members to join it. It's a completely voluntary thing. So I reject the argument that NATO is expanding. The other thing is this idea that some organization may be expanding to encroach on the sphere of influence or the neighborhood of Russia. These are Cold War categories that are being used, and we're beyond that. Nobody should be thinking in terms of spheres of influence. This is all very 19th century. I would maybe stop there.
Right. In terms of the economic repercussions of the war, we know that there was, the winter went well for Europe compared to what a lot of people had.
The winter's still going on in Europe, sorry.
But people had much more negative views of how it might pan out. But thankfully that didn't happen.
Because the weather is warmer. The weather is cooperating.
Yeah. So God's on your side.
Yes, absolutely.
And so what potential economic repercussions do you see coming out of this conflict?
Well, inflation is out of control. Fuel prices are rising. Thankfully, not as much as was the fear. But people are very careful in being, doing a lot of conservation. All the official buildings in Brussels, just to give you an example, are not allowed to turn the heat up beyond 19 degrees. So sweaters are, very in fashion these days in Brussels, and gasoline prices, petrol, that sort of thing. So that's what is going on, and it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. But I take heart in the fact that Europeans really are banding together, and all the polling suggests that there's a very strong understanding of the need to support Ukraine, the need to support Ukrainians. People are opening their homes to refugees. They are donating money. They're donating clothing. It's an all of society kind of effort.
Makes sense. A lot of people in Asia are drawing a parallel between how Europe has generally dealt with the Ukrainian refugees and historically has dealt with the Syrian refugees, and they say that it's sort of hypocritical, or the treatment has been different. Whether that is because they couldn't connect with people from the Middle East, or I don't know the answer to that. But how do you see the treatment that has been? People have been very open to refugees from Ukraine, whereas when it was Syrians, there was a lot of mixed opinions on that as they came to the European shores, and also. So this is connected in that aspect that NATO, I believe, was part of the coalition that came into Afghanistan and then went into Iraq. For a lot of people, when today NATO is shown as a defensive organization, they do raise the question what it was doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Syria was a different conflict altogether, and I'm not going to go there. But in these two countries particularly, and particularly in Iraq, there were a lot of human casualties, and the human rights overall situation was definitely a big question mark. And so it's a little difficult for a lot of people to see the Ukraine crisis in the same breath as has historically, we've taken these conversations.
Yeah. Well, that's it. You've posed about 15 questions in one, very skillfully. So let me make two main points, and we come back to that if I haven't touched upon your questions. The first thing is this, what I call whataboutism. So Ukraine is being treated. Ukrainians are being treated differently. Ukraine is being treated differently than other wars in the past or other conflicts in the past. And what about this? What about Iraq? What about Afghanistan? Before coming to Pakistan, I served in South Africa. So, what about Mozambique? What about Congo? This whataboutism, as it's known as, suggests that everything is comparable, but these are apples and oranges that we're comparing, and you can't really compare. I mean, they're both fruit, yes, not mango, the king of fruits, as we know, but they're both fruit. And the point is, my point is, each conflict, military or otherwise, should be taken on its own merits. Yes, there were differences certainly within Europe over Iraq and what happened there, and whether there was a casus belli or not. Not everybody at the time was privy to the kind of intelligence that some of the bigger countries had. So there was a split, in fact, in Europe over Iraq. Afghanistan, I don't want to speak for NATO. I cannot speak for NATO. But that was also related to, but each conflict has its own, should be considered with its own arguments on its own merits. The main question to ask is what is happening consistent with international law or not? Is it right or is it wrong? And this should be posed about any conflict. The second thing I wanted to mention was one of your many questions in the first part of the question, and that was on refugees and different treatment. I don't disagree with you. Actually, the crisis in Syria and the migration wave that came from 2015 was not the first one. The first one was in the early 90s. With the wars in former Yugoslavia and Bosnia, and that's where a huge wave of refugees also came to Europe. I had a front row seat for the Syrian migration crisis because I was then working for President Tusk, and he was of course very much involved in that. And now we come to Ukraine. So I can tell you from having sat through these meetings of the European Council that the discussions over the migration from as a result of this war in Syria were, the leaders were trying to figure out what to do, and there were very many different ideas, but a lot of the discussions there have resulted in instruments and procedures and ways of looking at things that have now been helpful in the Ukraine area. So what I'm saying is that there's a learning curve. Also, organizations experience learning curves, and that's exactly what happened between the Syrian migration and the migrants that are coming because of the Russia war on Ukraine.
Makes sense. I'm going to switch the conversation a little bit and take it to climate change, which is now, I believe, for Pakistan, it's a very important topic. We went through one of our worst floods in the history of this country, and recently the government of Pakistan was in Geneva as well, and raised quite a lot of loans and donor money as well to rehabilitate essentially 1/3 of Pakistan that was drowning. Tell me a little bit about what the EU is doing for climate change. Why did they decide to go towards this route? And what is the vision of the future that the EU has that could potentially see a world that doesn't abuse its resources as much as it does today, and we can look at a much cleaner and greener world than today?
Yeah, thanks. I was in Sindh while most of the areas were still very much affected. So I saw this with my own eyes when I had Commissioner Lenarčić, our emergency response commissioner here in September, and it was horrible. What has happened here? Pakistan emits very little and was really hit hard. And I would say this was not just one of the worst floods in Pakistan's history. It was one of the worst floods in the world's history. And so from that point of view, it was a real, a catalyst, I would say, for what happened later at the COP. What is the EU doing? The EU has resolved to be carbon neutral by 2050. And it means also that as an interim step, we intend to be 55% below our 1990 level emissions by 2030. So that's a lot of numbers, and the policy is called Fit for 55, and it's not a fitness program for people over the age of 55, but it is about emissions. So that's the aim, that's the goal, and the way to get there is what we call the European Green Deal. And so that is, it's all about sustainable development. It's actually an economic growth strategy with the aim of transitioning toward carbon neutrality, but doing it in such a way that it's inclusive and it actually produces growth. So our Vice President, Executive Vice President for Climate Change, Frans Timmermans, says that, look, this is not a climate policy. It's actually an economic growth policy, and so that's what we're doing in Europe. But part of that is also, we all live in one world. There are political borders don't matter. So we're interested also in the fact that the rest of the world is also coming along. We're happy to be a leader in this respect, but we want others to come along because we care about the environment also in other places other than Europe. So this is part of our the way we talk also to countries, other countries.
In terms of the emissions. How would you, or rather, how does Europe feel about, because there's a new economy rising now with carbon credits and, carbon tax and so on and so forth. And there has to be an economic model that incentivizes the move towards green and carbon neutral, ways of doing business. But within that breadth, obviously, carbon is a major form of energy, or carbon-based energy sources are a major or cheaper form of energy. And so for a lot of the developing world, what they've seen is, Europe and the global north and then Western world in particular, having spent a lot of that carbon historically and being able to develop themselves by proxy of that. And today, obviously, I was reading a very interesting research article a couple of days ago that where the author had basically quantified how the per capita emission that people in Pakistan, for example, emit, and the per capita emission that people in Europe emit. And if we were to define the cost of emission it would almost lead up to $30 billion a year coming to Pakistan to develop with alternate forms of energy, absolutely. But do you think there could potentially be a mechanism where those who have used these forms of these hydrocarbon fuels and have had a lot of carbon emissions historically can pay for the development? Because the fact is, otherwise the global south is going to get lost because the newer forms of energy are expensive. There is a huge buy-in there, and they're going to be cut out. I'll give you an example of Pakistan, for example. We can talk all about the solar panels and the wind plants and the hydroelectric plants, but the last month's report of the cost of producing electricity, on average, it was around 45 to 50 rupees per unit. And there was a new plant that was heavily criticized when it was being commissioned under CPEC that was built around coal. And that plant costs 4.5 rupees per unit. And for a lot of Pakistanis, what they're looking at is they're saying, okay, I mean, that's 1/10 the cost of what energy normally costs. And energy is a huge problem in Pakistan, as you know very well. And so they're very confused about this conversation around climate change. They're like, so if we have the opportunity now to be able to use cheaper forms of energy to develop ourselves, do we have to change and adhere to these rules that countries who have already developed and have already spent a lot of carbon are now creating? And if we do adhere to these rules, will we be will we get any reparations for all of the time that we didn't and they did, and we're now reeling from those repercussions?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is another 15,000 questions in one, but
I apologize for that. I have a lot of thoughts on these things.
No, but it's the topic of the day, right? You ask whether Europe or whether the rest of the world or the industrialized world understands and is not penalizing developing countries. Again, nobody 50 years ago necessarily thought that there was an issue. Not in Europe, not in North America, not anywhere. It was only climate science and the development of that is a fairly recent phenomenon. So did we make mistakes in the past? Absolutely. Do we realize that? Oh, yes. And does Europe understand the need for mitigation and adaptation? Absolutely. And that's what the Paris Agreement is all about. That's what the COP discussions, the UN discussions are all about. Europe produces about 9% of the globe's emissions these days, but we provide about 30% of the public global financing for climate. So that puts us in a pretty good position. We're paying a lot more than we emit, so to speak. Not that anybody's counting, but we would like to see some of the other countries who are mega huge emitters kicking in also money to help countries like Pakistan adapt and mitigate what's going on already. So yeah, we work. This is climate change is one of the areas that we work very closely with Pakistan on, not only just on climate diplomacy, but to see what we can do concretely here to help out. We have a fairly robust development program here, and a good chunk of it for this current budget cycle is going specifically to sustainable, green economic growth. Exactly for this reason, because we recognize that this is an issue for Pakistan, for other countries around the world. We recognize that we have played a role in this, and we have a certain responsibility to help fix the problem. So absolutely. Now, you talked about some of the carbon emissions or trading schemes and that sort of thing. You maybe are referring to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM as we call it, that is coming into effect in October in the European Union. What that is is an attempt to encourage other countries to take the same kind of ambitious climate-sensitive approach that the European Union has. And the whole point is to look at to make sure that countries, or to encourage companies not to take their production outside of the European Union, because outside of the European Union it's more expensive, because in many countries of the world you don't have to adhere to certain rules and regulations concerning pollution and climate and that sort of thing. So that's the whole point of this thing. I've heard a lot of nervousness, especially from business leaders here in Pakistan, when I go around the country and talk to people over the CBAM and what this is going to do for exports, because Pakistan exports about 1/3 of all its exports to the European single market. What I can say on that is that the CBAM will take effect as of October. There's a 5-year transition period, and initially it only focuses on 5 different sort of industrial products, none of which is anything that Pakistan exports to the EU. But in the long run, this will become an issue, because it's becoming an issue for consumers, especially young consumers, especially like of the age of your audience for this podcast. And I know this very well from my own kids. I have a 24 and a 25-year-old, and one of them is a vegan for environmental reasons, and they go around turning off the lights, and they are concerned about things like this, and only buy vintage and this sort of thing. So this is something that our especially young consumers are very interested in, and that has led also to the European Union's having adopted, our laws are called kind of directives, and so there's a new directive also that is similar to in aim to CBAM, and it's called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Long name, but the point is for exporters into the EU increasingly to have to meet certain standards all along the supply chain for anything that comes in. And the idea is we shouldn't, as an EU, be exporting pollution. I mean, that's the bottom line. Yeah.
Right. You mentioned that EU has been actively working on climate change in Pakistan. If you could just sort of mention what are some of the areas that you're working on, and then beyond climate change as well, what all is EU engaged on in Pakistan?
Okay. I mean, on climate, we this is one of our focal points for our development cooperation during this 7-year period of our budget, and so we're programming these funds right now, but we're focusing in this budget cycle on Gilgit-Baltistan and KP and Balochistan, and specifically on energy, sustainable energy, and also we're doing some TVET also because we're interested in getting people to work. But it has, so it's on resilience and energy questions, and can't tell you specifics because we don't have the specifics yet. They're still programming the money. In general, what the EU is doing together with Pakistan is, I mentioned before, we're covering the waterfront because the EU has grown to cover most areas of life, most policy areas. But the 3 kind of main thrusts of our work here is it's development cooperation, it's trade, and it's political engagement. And we have something that's called the Strategic Engagement Plan, which sets out, it's a blueprint really for where we want to take our relationship in the next 10 years, whatever. And this is an agreed document between Pakistan and the EU. So it focuses on those three areas that I talked about: political, meaning, rule of law, democracy, good governance, human rights; trade, the GSP plus, which we haven't really even talked about yet so much, but it has this program, the GSP plus, has produced a situation in which Pakistani exports into the EU, since it started in 2013, have grown by 2/3. So it's really, really, really important. And it's all about trade and Pakistan's fulfilling obligations, 27 human rights and labor law international conventions. So that's trade. We talked about politics. And there's also the development, which I touched upon as well. But this strategic engagement plan, this kind of blueprint document, also sets out how to talk, how we would like to cooperate on things like migration and legal mobility. I just had a Commissioner Hasan, who was here a couple months ago, has launched this dialogue that we will start now having on these specific, on migration and also legal pathways to get to the European Union, which we see as a win-win. The strategic engagement plan also sets out a bunch of other policy areas that we would like to work on, like education and culture, science and tech, peace and security, of course, as well. And so it's an aspirational document. So a part of it actually reflects what's going on now, but part of it is aspirational. And so, it's a blueprint. We need to build the building.
Makes sense. Pertaining to the climate funding that's coming in, particularly for the flood-affected areas, we heard a lot about that in Geneva as well. And then also in other areas where you mentioned you're focusing on energy in KP, Gilgit-Baltistan, and then Balochistan. Obviously, Pakistanis have this huge problem with the way that the current elite are inherently or allegedly corrupt. And so does the EU have the right mechanisms to ensure transparency and ensure that money is actually being used in the right way and actually helps people on the grassroots? For example, if we talk about rehabilitation, are we talking about actual quantifiable, managed, if we're talking about, let's say, housing units? Are there mechanisms in place to ensure that the right quality and the right, so you could give out the money, theoretically that money could show you the reports as well on ground, but then what tends to begin to happen is, if there are 100 housing units and 1,000 people require those housing units, it doesn't necessarily go out to those who deserve it the most. It tends to go around based on political affiliations and so on and so forth. And historically, donor money has been misused in Pakistan by the ruling elite time and again, and more people are one of the reasons why the youth are very despondent in today's day and age is because they feel fairly helpless. And so tell me a little bit about how this funding will and how you will ensure the transparency of all of these funding and these development projects.
Yeah, okay. Let me, you brought up two things that both involve money, but one is emergency humanitarian, the other is rehabilitation, development, that sort of thing. So let me address first the humanitarian part of it. I get every time when the floods, the waters were highest, and I was tweeting a lot about this or that or the third assistance package that has come through from one or another of our member states or from the EU per se, then I would get a bunch of comments in the Twitter feed saying, "Oh, don't give money to this government; they're corrupt," or "Make sure you know where your money is going," or God forbid that you pass a check to these, And let me just clear up a certain misconception then. On humanitarian funding, the European Union never gives money directly to governments. What we do is we give it to an implementing partner, and that implementing partner may be, for instance, one of the European member state agencies, or it could be the UN, or it could be an NGO, but never does it go directly to the government. That's on humanitarian emergency, assistance, which there was quite a lot of, very close to 200 million from European Union and its member states. Then the other thing is the reconstruction, the development, right? Reconstruction efforts. And first, I should have said this earlier, but whenever there's a development project or an idea that we're trying to implement together here in Pakistan, then these are part of an overall program that we have agreed together with the government of Pakistan based on Pakistan's own defined national development goals. It's agreed together. We don't do anything that Pakistan does not itself see as a priority. And so that's something that a point I want to make, because not everybody, not other donor countries or constituencies do it that way. The other thing you ask, whether it's on reconstruction, whether it's being used, how do we know that it's being used the right way? Well, there are all manner of regulations, rules, finance management, hoops that any recipient of EU development aid has to go through, has to jump through. And you can talk to any NGO in this country, and they will tell you how complicated it is to get money from the EU, and all the monitoring reports and all the transparency and accountability mechanisms that we have in place. It's unbelievable. But why do we do this? We do this precisely because we have to be accountable to our taxpayers. This is EU taxpayer money that we're spending here, and we need to be able to tell them exactly where it's gone. And so, no, you can never say 100%, but there are all kinds of mechanisms in place and audits and so forth. And we have a whole section of the EU delegation in Islamabad who is devoted only to this sort of thing, to making sure the money is used in accordance with the aims of the project and in accordance with the principles of good public finance management.
Makes sense. I wanted to know a little bit about the visa regime for Pakistanis. And I understand Pakistan is a huge population, developing world. And I understand there have been Pakistanis tend to, work around systems, and it gets difficult. So I'll empathize there. I'm not going to say, give us a free visa regime and there's going to be a lot of Pakistanis there. But I applied to Europe once. I think I applied to Germany because the German government invited me to cover one of their solar power plants, manufacturing sites. And it was an excruciating process. And I think most people in Europe do not understand how something as simple as mobility is so complicated. And it's excruciating for a large number of reasons. First being it's anxiety inducing. You have to get all the documents ready. You have to get them printed. In today's day and age, where every paper printed is bad for the climate, you have to get them printed. You have to get them sent. Then, when you go in for one of those interviews, it was a very small area, maybe for 6 to 7 people to sit down. This was peak summer. They had a shed outside, no fans, no food or water available. 100 plus people sitting outside, some as old as 70 years old, waiting for their turn, and some had to wait for 6 to 8 hours with no food or water. And these were horrible conditions, not expected, in my opinion, from the first world, let alone EU, which prides itself on, human development and human rights. And so I get that there is some sort of a management of who gets the visa and who doesn't. Can there be better mechanisms for that? Do we have in today's day and age, do we have to have these sort of interviews and in-person situations when the digital world is so advanced? Can we not have documents mailed in online and then some sort of a mechanism to judge and gauge who has that access and who doesn't? Because I feel like that's just going to make a lot of it much more easier for a lot of people. They have to travel hundreds of kilometers just to appear to these interviews, and like I said, the conditions are not the very best in Pakistan. There's a security situation there as well. So I mean, you've probably been to embassies all over the world. They're very different. They're very available. In Pakistan, it's part of this enclave, and so some sort of innovation there in terms of digital could be incredibly useful. And then secondly, just generally, how is it gauged to define who can and cannot get access to be able to visit? And I'm not even talking about, I do have the following question on immigration, on legal immigration, as you mentioned earlier, that you're working with the government on as well. But this question is particularly for people who want to visit and explore, Europe and its culture.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we at the EU delegation we don't give visas. Visa policy is the one of the most closely guarded attributes of statehood. Therefore, this is something that the member states have kept for themselves. So they give the visas. Consular work is purely a member state competence. And what we do in the EU is we coordinate. So if there are systemic issues, then we try to bring it to the attention of whoever can fix it. So let me say that just to start with. So I can't answer any of your questions regarding
that's not part of the mandate. So
ask one of my colleague ambassadors to come in who issues visas. On the digitality or the wisdom of doing a kind of a more hip and happening way of issuing visas, what you're describing is the Pakistan visa system, which is online, totally digitalized, and very easy. And so I think
so we're more progressive than the EU.
I think that the EU, some of what you're doing here, we could take as inspiration for sure. But let me say that I agree with you when you say that Europeans have no idea how difficult it is, because we have quite a strong passport. We don't, in many parts of the world, we don't necessarily have to apply for a visa. And internally within the EU, we have this borderless thing with Schengen. So there are many people, many young people who just have grown up thinking that you don't need a passport to go from Sweden to Italy, because in fact you don't. But they don't know what it was like before. And so I do think that many Europeans have forgotten how difficult it can be to get the mobility because they're not used to it. But again, this you asked, the fundamental question is, why is there basically, why is it so hard? Why is it made so arduous? And why, you didn't say it, but the other part of it is why are so many people denied visas? And that all has to do with all the member states look at it purely in terms of percentages. You may want to travel and backpack around and see Bologna and see the Eiffel Tower and go see the beautiful spires of my native Estonia. But there are plenty of people, lots and lots of people from Pakistan who abuse the limits, and they overstay. And generally speaking, but again, you would have to have one of my member state colleagues in here to tell you this for sure, but many countries look specifically at the percentage of overstays, and that's how they gear how many visas they're going to give out. And they base it on who is likely to come back. It's that simple. So when many people abuse the system, the others suffer, unfortunately.
Right. I'm going to wrap this up because we're at the 1 hour 30-minute mark and we're almost at our cutoff time as well. But one particular question, and this links with the immigration that you spoke of earlier as well, legal immigration. What I see right now is Europe has an aging population, and right now it's going through recession. But even before that, the economic growth was a major question mark for Europe. There are going to be two questions actually. So to start off with,
only two.
to start off with, I think the way that I see it, I think Europe would require young, educated workers coming in over the next couple of decades to ensure that the aging population is taken care of, because you need people to be productive in a society. But in the background of right-wing movements, more closed-up societies, a lot of conversation and chatter around and against immigration. How do you think that is going to be possible, considering the dynamic of the demographic of modern-day Europe? And generally, with the recession happening, with the Ukraine-Russia war, how do you see Europe finding its way towards growth again? Do you think the golden time of Europe, of pre-peace and growth and all of that, is currently now a big question mark on whether it's going to continue or not?
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right that Europe is an aging population, and we need young people, and we need what Pakistan has. A lot of young people who are IT savvy, who are maybe programmers or less skilled, can serve as caregivers. This is exactly what Commissioner Johansson was talking about when she was here in November. And what we're doing now in this new dialogue that we're just launching, it's in its real baby steps. So we don't have anything specific yet, but the whole point is to start talking about the needs that Pakistan has in terms of getting people employed and making sure there's a productive way forward for especially for young people, and the needs that Europe has, many European countries and companies, for workers and for caregivers and that sort of thing. So it kind of is a match made in heaven, and this is what we're trying to bring the two sides together to talk about what we as governments can do to facilitate this. It's not for the EU to produce 500 workers for X factory, but it is for the EU and for the government of Pakistan to make this make sense, to facilitate match up the needs amongst themselves. So that's what this dialogue on migration and legal mobility is all about. Is the golden age of Europe over? Maybe it's not even begun yet. No, I think I agree that we're at a turning point, and I feel that we have been at a turning point for the last 5 or 7 years. It's clear that the old ways of doing things are coming to an end, partly because it's all been carbon-based, partly because it's been only reaping the kind of the positive aspects of globalization. I feel like, in my gut, I feel like this is one of those moments in history where later the historians will say, it started here, and that was when the shift occurred. And I think part of the shift also is this green transition. For any number, I think it's going to, in the next 50 years, it's going to change the way we live, the way we move, what we buy, how we buy it, what we eat. I think we're on the cusp of major change. And of course, Europe's part of that as well.
You talk about the turning point, and this is going to be my last question. There's a turning point in the world as well, where we seem to be moving from unipolar world to a multipolar world. it's a sudden shift between East and West. Europe somehow lies in the middle, and European Union as a union itself is in those multipolar dimensions. European Union is a pole of its own, and so how do you see European Union maneuvering through this situation where it seems like, with the rise of China, there is but it's not just China. Asia has a very different language. Suddenly, Asia is consolidating in a lot of ways, and Asia has a direct connectivity with Europe as well, where there could be a lot of areas of partnership as we go ahead. And if the conversation and the environment becomes more polarized and more, we begin to go back to the Cold War scenario, Europe, it seems, would find itself in the middle where it'll be forced to choose sides. And I saw, this was, I believe, last year or the end of 2021, where the Chinese government officials were in the EU, and there was a lot of chatter on trade agreements, but then what Europe has to say, what Europe doesn't has to say, a lot of it's very political, and there's a lot of this thing about political correctness. I can understand, because Pakistan has always been there. Pakistan has to sit between China and the US. Pakistan has to sit between Iran and Saudi Arab, and a lot of these historic rivals, Pakistan has to maneuver through them. European Union has been very clear in its partnerships historically, but the world is changing, and we are at a turning point. And so how do you see Europe's role in the new world?
Well, we're not straddling anything. We've chosen a side, if you will. And it's the side of fundamental rights and international law. That's whose side we're on. And whoever's also on the for those things, for those elements, that's who we feel most comfortable with. Doesn't mean that we don't talk to everybody else, and we do. And it's clear that Asia is ascendant, and that's part of the reason we are paying also in the European Union much more attention to Asia. Connectivity strategy, something we call the Global Gateway, something we call the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's all looking east. It's looking to Asia as a natural partner for the European Union. But if you ask, there's that adage that tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are. I think I hope it's quite clear that the European Union stands for values. We have values in our DNA, and we will stand with the oppressed, not the oppressor.
Makes a lot of sense. I'm just going to wrap this up. This is a question generally that I ask all of my guests, and if you could give me a vision of the future of the world in 2050, the way that you see it. Based on what you know now, you have an extensive experience. I think if there is anyone who can see the future, it's generally diplomats. The way that the insight that they have, the vision that they have based on all the information that's available to them. How do you see the world 30 years from now in 2050, or 27 years from now in 2050, knowing what you know now, seeing what you've seen throughout your life?
Yeah, I think that diplomats try very hard never to be drawn into a question like that, because it's all about speculation and looking at the crystal ball, which I forgot my crystal ball at home. I think if you think, those, I basically already touched upon your question. By 2050, I think most people will have given up eating meat. We will all be walking or using bicycles or other modes of transportation. Most energy sources will be renewable. And we won't be traveling by certainly jet planes much anymore. yeah, I think that's pretty much. We won't be buying new stuff either, probably. Sorry for the producers, but yeah, that's where I think
very
we're going.
nifty, very clean, very green. You think we'll be able to achieve the goals that are laid out, or are they too ambitious in terms of climate change?
Look, if you somebody told me once that if you reach for the stars, you may not make it, but you won't end up with a handful of mud either. So you have to start someplace.
Makes sense. Riina, thank you so much for coming in, giving us so much time. This was incredible. I learned so much about the EU. And how long have you been in Pakistan, by the way?
6 months.
6 months. Oh, so it's very recent. How has Pakistan been treating you?
Very well, thank you.
I'm glad. Thank you so much for being part of the show and sharing all the insights.
Thanks a lot.
And for all of you guys, thank you so much for watching. अगर आपको एपिसोड पसंद आई अपने दोस्तों के साथ जरूर शेयर करिएगा. YouTube वाले लाइक का बटन दबाएंगे, एंगेजमेंट बढ़ेगी, ज़्यादा लोगों तक हमारी कन्वर्सेशन पहुंचेगी. ऑडियो प्लेटफॉर्म्स वाले सब्सक्राइब का बटन दबाएंगे, आने वाली एपिसोड्स की आपको नोटिफिकेशन मिलेगी. इसी के साथ साथ फेसबुक वाले नीचे दी गई हुई लिंक पर क्लिक करेंगे, TBT कम्युनिटी ज्वाइन कर सकते हैं, जहाँ पर हम डिफरेंट फीडबैक भी लेते हैं, गेस्ट रिकमेंडेशन भी लेते हैं, आर्टिकल भी शेयर करते हैं. और मुझे ज़रूर ये भी बताइएगा कि आपको इस कॉन्वर्जेसन के बारे में व्हाट आर योर थॉट्स ऑन इट. कमेंट सेक्शन में आके बताएं. डू यू एग्री और डिसएग्री विद एनीथिंग? लेट अस नो इन द कमेंट सेक्शन बिलो. बट एनीवेज, यहाँ पर कहीं पर इजी पैसा जैज़ का इशारा होगा एंड सादा पे आ रहा होगा. इफ यूड लाइक टू सपोर्ट द चैनल, वी एक्सेप्ट एनीथिंग फ्रॉम ₹1 to as much as you'd like. It's the thought that counts. But anyways, this was Sayyid Muzamil Hasan Zaidi. You are watching Thought Behind Things. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.